It's easy to say it, another superlative lap by Max Verstappen, but it actually is his first proper pole, as Christian Horner pointed out on the radio on his in-lap since the Austrian Grand Prix, amazingly. Well, not amazingly, because Red Bull have had a pretty tough time in the summer and the early fall in terms of grip, aero efficiency, balance, whatever you want to call it. They kind of lost the sweet spot, the operating sweet spot for the car. And it's been a tough second half of the year for Max, but it all kind of changed in Brazil, of course, in the rain, and then Vegas was a bit scrappy, but it was good. And then we have Qatar, and he's on the pole for Qatar, having looked nowhere yesterday, really, in terms of overall aero efficiency, grip versus balance versus top speed. And it kind of showed up in the sprint race today when he backed off on the early lap to miss Carlos Sainz on the opening lap, lost a bit of momentum, got behind Pierre Gasly and Kevin Magnussen, passed Gasly, but never got past Kevin Magnussen, just droned around. Ho-hum, yeah, it was only a sprint race, who really cares? And the focus then obviously was on qualifying for the Grand Prix. A few changes made to the RB20. Your guess is as good as mine as to what they did. I suspect something to do with ride height, maybe the track picking up grip. But interestingly, at the Qatar circuit, we have the speed trap relatively near the start-finish line. And it's really interesting to see how the performance of the two numbers squared out in qualifying. But before we get down to that, let's just have a look at the qualifying results so we kind of know where we're at and exactly what happened. So it's Max on the pole with 20.5 and George almost equaling that lap time. But as I speak, there potentially might well be some dramas because George Russell has made it clear that on his outlap, on his last set in Q3, he caught Max between turns 12 and 13, a quick part of the track, 7th gear normally, 8th if you're Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin, and had to really get on the anchors and ran wide and maybe damaged the floor, and Max was going apparently unduly slowly. Well, I've had a look at the replays of that, had a look at the numbers, and interestingly, the real problem there was Fernando Alonso, who I just said normally takes that corner in 8th. He just did one run in Q3 because he didn't have any more sets of soft tyres. He went out towards the end. And on that lap, as I approached turns 12 and 13, Max was going reasonably quickly, 5th, 6th gear, but Alonso was in 4th gear, went down to 3rd at 131 kilometers an hour, and Max had to brake really hard behind Alonso. And then, of course, George Russell caught Max, and all he saw was Max, and that was why it's coming. So I think the Red Bull argument will be, well, you know, we were just slowing behind Fernando, who was going really slowly as well. So I'll be surprised if Max does get a penalty for that, and indeed it may well be Fernando Alonso who's called before the stewards. Who knows? Anyway, continuing that, and assuming there are no changes, it's Max on the pole, George Russell alongside him. Interesting race. It'll be really interesting to see how the Mercedes gets on with its tyre deg during the race. Lando Norris, who won, I say he won the sprint race. He didn't actually win the sprint race. Amazingly, he slowed right at the end to give the win to Oscar Piastri, who had been towing along with DRS to try and get him away from George, make it difficult for George Russell to pass. George had got overtaken by Oscar very early in the race, in first lap indeed. And you thought, well, you know, Lando's just cruising here. But in fact, he just slowed right down and let Oscar win, which is very sweet of him and shows another side of Lando's character. He's a really nice guy, isn't he? And he's just thinking, oh, well, you know, Oscar gave me the win in Brazil. I better do the same back. I owe it to him. He gave me those points there, which is all very nice. But my point about all this is not Lando and Oscar. It's the way they manage them at the front of the team. It's very, very important to make sure that the driver who has the best chance of winning the championship is not diluted by the other driver. Yeah, help one another. That's fine. That's great. Be big mates if you want to. But you've got to make sure you focus on maximizing the points. And that's not what the management at McLaren have done since the Hungarian Grand Prix, in my opinion. And I still stand by the 37 points that Lando Norris could have been taking into the Las Vegas Grand Prix and the championship. Imagine if the championship was still alive and Lando had won the sprint race today and Max had been only 7th or 6th or 7th or wherever he was. Everyone was saying, wow, Lando Norris potentially going to be world champion. But because he doesn't have those points, it's all moot, isn't it? Anyway, that was the sprint race and that was the drama there. So Lando Norris did a pretty good job, 20.7, Oscar Piastri 20.8, just behind him. Charles Leclerc 20.8, Lewis Hamilton 21.0, Carlos Sainz, and then Fernando Alonso. Sergio Perez actually made it through to Q3. Unbelievable. Anyway, getting back to what I was talking about in terms of what we saw between the finish line and the speed trap, let's have a look at that. That's the order in which they qualified. So Max Verstappen, as he's going across the finish line, 283, and then he accelerates up to 323, which is a difference of 40 kilometers an hour in a relatively short space. The speed trap just before the braking area into turn 1. George Russell is quicker out of the last corner and therefore carries that speed across the start-finish line 3 kilometers quicker. But look at the difference in top speed, 321, and the difference overall is only 35. Now that's significant, I think. That's probably where Red Bull have found some pace since the sprint race, because they could, of course, make changes to the car as a result of what they felt in the sprint race before going into Parc Fermé for qualifying. So there's an interesting thing. That, to me, adds up to more aero efficiency on the Red Bull all of a sudden. Now, it may well be they've just gone a little bit lower with the car. They've got the car to work a little bit better aero-wise. Normally, that would hurt your top speed. But as you can see there, the Red Bull suddenly looking pretty good in terms of top speed. Only Fernando Alonso a little bit quicker in the Aston Martin. He was quickest overall. Lando Norris, 283, same as Max Verstappen out of the last corner, significant because we know how good the McLaren is in terms of its downforce and its grip. And it only accelerates to 319 before the speed trap, so only 36. Oscar Piastri, even worse, 34 is the difference. Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, about the same as Red Bull, but in the overall lap, they're not there. So they don't have quite the same air efficiency, but they've got a similar ethos, if you're with me there. And then interestingly, the last three there, Fernando Alonso, Sergio Perez, Kevin Magnussen, very similar numbers, you could say, to Max Verstappen, except for one thing, the lap time. And of course, what's going on around the rest of the lap is very significant when you're computing it into aero efficiency, as we're seeing here. That has to be taken into account as well, which is why I gave the lap times out first. So quite interesting, I think. I think the main significant takeaway from that is that Red Bull have got a lot of aero efficiency again. And if you look at that top speed, that puts them in good shape tomorrow. Whereas Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri relatively slow in a straight line, but of course they will have DRS, so that's not as big a handicap potentially as it would be if they're out the front of the grid. So in that sense, you could say maybe from McLaren's point of view, it's kind of cool that they're on the second row, not on the front row. Just getting back to DRS, it was interesting after the sprint race, the number of people that were complaining about the DRS train at the front, by which they mean, of course, that the car that's running second is so close to the car in front that it has DRS as well. And then there's George Russell, who's getting held up in P3, and he can do nothing about Oscar Piastri because he's got this ongoing DRS benefit from Lando Norris. And there was a bit of a discussion afterwards about, and George raised the point, whether they should limit the number of laps in which you can have and use DRS, in which case you could strategize and maybe he would have had a better chance of passing Oscar Piastri. Of course, there was nobody there suggesting that we get rid of DRS altogether because it's just taken for granted that we've got to have it, like speed bumps in the road. But I reiterate the point. The way to solve this problem is not to have DRS in the first place, because if you look at that, George Russell 321, Oscar Piastri 318, Lando Norris 319. If we had no DRS, George Russell probably would have been able to pass both McLarens with a normal, healthy, natural slipstream if there was no DRS. But that never occurred to anybody. It didn't occur to him, obviously, and doesn't occur to anybody else because they're so used to thinking, well, we've got to have DRS. It's there forever. But if you really want to make it easier to overtake, get rid of DRS. That's what those numbers there say to me. And now down to Max's lap. The interesting thing about Max is that over the three phases of qualifying, Q1, Q2, Q3, he used only 3 new sets of soft tyres. Everybody else used a minimum of 4, and as you got further down the grid, it was 4, 5, even 6 sets of tyres, desperately trying to get into Q3. And the really interesting thing from that is that when we got into Q3, Red Bull had a completely different strategy to everybody else. Now, whether that is the reason Max was able to get the pole, of course, it comes under the black art of tyre dynamics and science. But what actually happened was that Max basically sat out the first few minutes of Q3, whereas all his major opposition went out on one and the first of 2 new sets of soft tyres and did a time. And Max went out when they all came in at the end of that first phase. He went out with the intention of just running that one set of new softs. And maybe he was short of them and maybe he had to do it. Maybe it was force majeure. I don't know. But he only ran that one set. And it was interesting when he did his first quick lap, when the track was pretty empty, it was a 20.620. And at that point, that made him P2 behind George Russell's 20.575. Max's engineer got on the radio to say, pretty good lap, Max, bearing in mind how much fuel you got in the car. And whether he did that just to sort of wind everybody else up, I don't know. I was thinking at the time, well, he's just winding everybody up. But then I thought, no, that's actually, he's going to stay out there now. He's going to stay out on that one set of tyres. And he's going to do another really hard push lap right at the end. And it's exactly what he did. So he got 2 very quick laps out of that one set of tyres where everybody else in the top 10 in Q3, apart from the guys at the back who'd run out of tyres, but we're talking about the key opponents, the key runners, front runners, everybody else ran 2 sets. And if you look at them, it was quite difficult on the second set in that last couple of minutes to get a time. George had done a 20.5. And then on his second run, did a 20.8. Now, maybe he will say, oh, that's because I ran wide and damaged the floor with that whole Max Verstappen thing. Well, I'm sure that's what he'll say. Max did a 20.6. And then his next lap, last lap, was a 20.520 to take the pole from George. Lando Norris went out on 2 sets, but on his first set, he didn't get a lap in at all. Traffic or made a mistake, didn't see it, and then came in and put on another set, and that was his P3 time, 20.7. Oscar Piastri, 21.1 on his first set, down to 20.8. Charles Leclerc, 20.885 on his first set, 20.852 on his second. So the track didn't look as if it was getting any quicker. And what I think, and Carlos Sainz similarly, 21.042, 21.041, and his 2 different runs on 2 sets of tyres. Whereas Max was on that one set. And I think in the closing minutes of Q3, with the track seemingly a little bit slower, the way to get perfection from the car was to have the second lap out of that one set of tyres. Call it the heat cycle, call it something else, but Max got it absolutely right by running that one set in Q3. As I say, whether that was judgment, whether that was luck, I don't know, but really interesting to see that and to hear how stable he thought the car was in its qualifying spec compared with yesterday. So brilliant bit of work by Max and Red Bull to read what was going to happen next and to do the lap as they did. Just going back through some of the other times, yeah, relatively disappointing for Ferrari, but I did say last week, before and for Vegas, in fact, that it wasn't going to be a great circuit for them here. There's too many longish, fast, medium-speed corners for Ferrari to be in their sweet spot. Lewis Hamilton, 21.0, George Russell, 20.5. Well, Lewis made it into Q3, and he did a good job-ish, but half a second away. Always looked to be half a second away. So kind of, I don't know. It's just kind of sad to see that, really, because I'm sure he, in his own mind, in his own way, he's doing the best job he can. All the engineers and mechanics are really working hard in the usual way of things, but it's just not happening for Lewis. There's something's gone there, and it's a bit of a shame to see. Well, it is a shame to see that. Carlos Sainz, virtually the same lap time as the guy who's replacing him at Ferrari, 21.0, just behind him. A bit of a lackluster qualifying session for Carlos Sainz on this occasion. I think the Ferrari, as I say, in these conditions was not great, and full marks to Charles Leclerc for getting the best from it. But the difference between the two, very, very small. Fernando Alonso overall did a very good job. As I say, he uniquely was taking turn 12 in 8th gear, which is quite impressive when you think about it. And then oddly coming down to 7th as he ran down the hill into the next kink. But so letting the car float in 8th, classic Fernando Alonso, really nice, 21.2. Look where Lance Stroll is, 21.9. So that's a bit healthier. That's a bit about where it should be from Fernando's point of view. Sergio Perez, as I say, kind of got his act together eventually, finally. Had a terrible sprint race, drone around at the back of the field. And I think they did some front wing testing as well. Maybe there was some change to the front flap that they tested on Perez's car in the sprint race, and it was the benefit of Max Verstappen. Unbelievable teamwork. Lando and Oscar, take note. So Sergio definitely played his role if that is the case. But anyway, he got into Q3, so we shouldn't be too facetious about it. Kevin Magnussen has been driving well all weekend, towards the end of his Formula One career, sadly, 21.5, very good. Pierre Gasly, a bit disappointed not to get into Q3. Well, very disappointed after the recent fireworks of Brazil and Vegas. Guanyu Zhou and Valtteri Bottas, very good job in the Saubers. the sort of doing what normally we would see the Visa Cash App cars, the VCARB cars doing, about taking that place and swapping around, as we've often seen in this current Formula One regulation. When they haven't got it right, the sweet spot's so elusive that one weekend you got it, one weekend you haven't. And this time, obviously the Sauber's not too bad. Yuki Tsunoda did a better job than Liam Lawson. But having said that, Liam Lawson very annoyed with who he thought was Fernando Alonso, but the engineer quickly corrected him and said, no, that was Lance Stroll that backed off right in front of you on his in-lap. So interesting that Lawson didn't know that. I'm thinking if that's significant or not. Most drivers, I mean, my experience, Nigel never really knew. He was one of the blue cars, one of the red cars. He never knew he was following. Carlos was very good. Carlos knew every driver. Possibly in the days when you could see the helmet, I don't know. But anyway, he thought it was Fernando, but it was actually Lance Stroll. Surprise, surprise. Williams, not good. 22.3. Alex Albon, Colapinto 22.5. 2/10, not bad from Colapinto's point of view, but from Williams' point of view, not good at all. Nico Hulkenberg, yeah. They kept saying, oh, we tried something, didn't work, blah, blah, blah. So that was that. And Esteban Ocon never seemed to be in the running. I don't know what the problem was there. So, yeah. Max Verstappen, wow, if he can get in front. Lando used a lovely phrase after the sprint race saying how nice it was to be leading the race and not to be in anybody's turbulence or dirty air. And he said how beautiful that feels. And in theory, I guess that's what Max Verstappen's going to be feeling tomorrow as he ekes out his normal lead, assuming he makes a decent start, which I'm sure he will, and looks after his tyres and tries to extend the stints. It is quite a physical race, this. The temperature's surprisingly cool still, which is one of the reasons I think the Mercedes is still going very well. But it is quite a physical circuit. Max will be fine. Lando also coming out with a little phrase saying, oh, I need to hit the gym a bit more. That's classic Lando. He's such a good guy, isn't he? Such a nice guy. I can't think of anybody that would have given that win to their teammate just on the basis of what happened in Brazil. When you take the overall picture of what's happened in the championship this year and what Oscar did to Lando going into the second chicane at Monza, for example, just as one example, and the Lando win that was lost in Hungary. Anyway, we won't go down that path again. We've said enough. So there we are. That is it. Max Verstappen on the pole ahead of George Russell. It's a good grid, isn't it? Red Bull, Mercedes, 2 McLarens, and then the Ferraris and Lewis Hamilton. Not bad at all. And Fernando Alonso there as well, kind of. So there we are. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and of course to TrackNinja for their support of this channel, and for you for watching. See you tomorrow.